Daniel chapter 5. And I thought last week that we would be done going through Daniel, or at least the part that we're going to go through, but I've just been thoughtful about this scripture today throughout the week, and especially yesterday, it just continued to churn in my heart and mind, and so I want to try to do what I believe to be right and to continue here in the book of Daniel. We often, I think, justifiably grow distressed as Christian people because it seems as though that our hearts and minds, as well as especially those that are without God and awaiting God's judgment, are unmoved by certain spiritual realities. I can't help but think that perhaps at times I have been complicit in causing such a numbness and a lack of response. There is a great danger of doing spiritual activity unspiritually. There's a great danger in doing religious spiritual activity unspiritually. When preachers preach, and when teachers teach, and when parishioners testify, and when singers sing, and when people who pray, pray, but it's done through religious form, often the question that comes to me is, I'm seeking to do something, is what is my aim in what I am doing? What am I aiming at? And I think rightfully so, there is an aim that is good and noble and necessary to some extent, but it is incomplete, and that is the aim for truth. Of all things, I think we should be truthful. However, is it possible that we can tell the truth, but it be absent the power of God? And my answer to that is a resounding yes. You can be a Sunday school teacher, you can be a parent trying to teach your kid the truth, you can be a preacher, and from a doctrinal standpoint, nothing be wrong in what you're saying. And yet, you and I both have fallen asleep during sermons that were like that. And rightfully so, probably. And I think the reason why that's dangerous is because it's like having a song without a melody. Can you rightly call something a song if it's never had a melody written with it? Because isn't it the melody that brings this dimension to it that mere words can't encompass alone? And I think spiritual activity is exactly the same. So what happens when spiritual activity like prayer and preaching and teaching is performed unspiritually over and over and over and over again? These truths are received in our hearts as almost fables and stories and distant things that are detached from us. What a danger for great spiritual realities to be counted as nothing because it's just men and women talking about truth. I'm afraid this morning that the subject that we're going to consider today is one of those that is grown callous to, and there's a numbness about, and there's a by all. And yet, if given the power and unction of what is meant in the truth, it is a truth that brings me to my knees. It's of the most somber and serious, and I can't imagine anything of greater consideration than some of the things that we'll talk about this morning. My prayer today is that God would in your heart add that layer that none of us can add. Your attention is necessary and appreciated, but even the utmost attention cannot give what only God can. And that is a spiritual perception of an eternal reality. If you're lost this morning, I wish that you would especially consider what we're going to talk about this morning. If you've never been saved, throw out the religious form and throw out the habit and throw out all the things that may allow us to compartmentalize these things as mere words and think about the reality for what it really is. The title of our message this morning is One God, One Man, Final Judgment. One God, one man, final judgment. Isn't it interesting that a cultural phrase that has risen is something that amounts to "you can't judge me"? And any time somebody feels like they're being judged by another, they're very quick to try to turn the tables, and by accusing them of being a judgmental person, then suddenly everybody begins to judge that person for being judgmental. Because like so many things, it seems to be just, in our day, a way to deviate attention from sin. But I want all of us to somberly consider the fact that one day we are going to be judged. Don't think about anybody else. Think about you. One day, you are going to stand before God. The subject of judgment is prevalent throughout the whole Bible. The very first story is full of it, isn't it? God gives a law. God provides all their needs. And the story ends with judgment. It doesn't end with judgment, but it's towards the end of the story. The very next story, Cain and Abel. Judgment. The Tower of Babel, judgment. Noah, the flood, judgment. Sodom and Gomorrah, judgment. We read this past Wednesday night in our Wednesday night study about what Paul was reasoning with Felix and Drusilla about. Righteousness, temperance, and the judgment that was to come. Revelation 20, the Bible nearly ends with because all those things, I believe, not only had a time and a place applicable in real time during those eras of history, But in many ways, all of those things point towards the future judgment. They're like these microcosms of what are to come. And as we read them, those things about future judgment ought to come out of the page to our hearts. That just like God confronted Adam and Eve, and just like Cain was punished for his sin, and just like Sodom and Gomorrah did not escape their pride, just like the wicked world that seemed to be getting away with it was met with the judgment of the flood, the reality is that every thought and deed are not going to find an escape. And in this story, we read about a powerful man. And isn't much of the cultural wars of our day, and having been that way for many years, but especially since the philosopher and thinker Karl Marx, hasn't there been cries that, it's always the rich that get away, it's always the powerful that get away. And there are times where that is true. At least from our vantage point. This powerful man seemed like he was going to get away with it. But what we learn here is that he didn't. And neither will you. Neither will I. This morning, there's a difference in trying to scare people and in trying to speak the truth. Sometimes that's a fine line. I'll tell you, my aim this morning is not to scare you. Coerced action is no good in the sight of God. You realize that? Like if I can coerce you to doing something, it's of no value. God wants a whosoever will, of your own accord, prompted by truth. And this truth is a somber one that strikes a chord in my heart and has for many, many years. And honestly, I don't even know how to express it, and I won't go off on this rabbit trail, but there's an element of fear in judgment, but that's not the overriding emotion of my heart when I consider it. The only way I know how to say it is just a seriousness oversets me when I consider the judgment. Like all the games, all the hiding, all the frivolity is over. It doesn't matter. And you're standing before your Creator. Now, there's often things that distort that picture in our minds. And I think this story begins, I don't know how much I'm going to read today. I think many of you know the story. If you don't, I'll try to summarize it as we go through. But this is many years after King Nebuchadnezzar has left the throne. Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children are presumably the 3 Hebrew children, but Daniel is still in Babylon. History tells us, though it's referenced in the King James as his father, that it's actually his grandfather. Nebuchadnezzar's was Belshazzar's grandfather, and it's just a common adage that was used, or title that was used to reference someone who came before you. Regardless, Belshazzar is the king. And in the first part of the story, he's having a party. And it's a big one. My mind immediately, as I read this story again, ran to the book of Esther. Because the book of Esther begins the exact same way. There was a grand party. Now, customary back then, when you would do something like this, when we think of a party, we probably think of a nice, good planning, and then you execute the party one night, and it may even go early into the morning, and then you're done. It's not how kings' parties worked back in the day. All the leaders of the province would travel from their province, and you would bring them into your kingdom. A lot of times it would last for weeks. In Esther's case, the party at the beginning of that story lasted for 180 days. Quite a party. Here, in chapter 5, we learn that there were 1,000 attendants at his party. Don't know how long it was. I suspect it lasted a few days, but I don't know that. And they're getting together, and they're well into the party. How do we know this? Because he's evidently drunk. So they're well into this party. He begins to instruct them to do things in violation of God's law and in violation of what Belshazzar knew was right before the eyes of God. Now, there's something about this story that is symbolic of how people think and act and work today, and perhaps all through time. And that is that there is a peace that comes sinning with others. There's a comfort that comes with sinning with other people. If I'm going to get caught, I'm going to get caught with, I can remember in high school sometimes doing things, and the question wasn't, really the main question was, are you going to do this with me? Right? Because if so, it implies in our hearts and minds, or what we want to believe, and perhaps what is the case even in the natural world sometimes, we think it dilutes judgment. Or in other words, we would think of it as if I did something wrong and I was fined $10, but there are 10 people with me, then we'll each pay $1. That will be our fine. And if I do it by myself, I have to meet the full judgment. And so perhaps as a culture runs fully into embracing and promoting and encouraging sin, perhaps one of the not only motivations, but the salves that we can put on our conscience, or lost person, a salve in rejecting God that you can find in your conscience, is this false assumption that your judgment will be diluted if everybody is doing it. And that is far from the case. All of these people were present at the party. But in the end of the story, there was one man standing before one God with a final judgment. 1,000 people are there, and they violate the vessels of God. They begin to, in the midst of this big ungodly gathering, bring these golden vessels in that were taken out of the sacred place of the temple of God, and they begin to abuse it. What do you think when God has given us an institution like marriage and we take it and we abuse it? Many examples I'll let you take of your own heart, but that God made. The home. And people stray from God's design, recreated in their own desired image, suffer the consequences of it, never confessing in the end, maybe we shouldn't have done it that way. But everybody's doing it, you know? But I think that's the thing that ought to bring us back from the precipice of jumping into the abyss of what everybody's doing. Well, yeah, but in the end, I'm going to stand before God for me. For my thoughts, my actions, my deeds, my leadership in the home. the roles God placed upon me. And I'm going to give an account for that. Not all of those people. The psalmist laments in one of my favorite psalms, Psalm 73, because it's something that so many Christians bemoan today. Our hearts just naturally cry these things out in moments of when we don't see the whole picture, when we're blinded temporarily by things. That's how the psalmist was in Psalm 73 when he saw the prosperity of the wicked, who he said had no bands in their death. There seemed to be no pain and no anguish, even in their death. They seemed to prosper and not suffer as others did. And so he goes through this long 8 or 10 or 12 stanza song talking about how that the wicked always seemed to prosper, whereas the godly always seemed to suffer. And he attempted to reconcile that puzzle in his mind, and he was brought to a point of despair. And certainly, with our limited understanding and without the ability of foresight, we have to understand scenarios as such, we have to trust the promises of God, which relate eternal truths that we cannot of our own limited perspective see. And the psalmist there says, "Until I went into the sanctuary of the Lord, then understood I their end." Or in other words, he got a sense of perspective. He went into the presence of God. That's where the sanctuary of God is denoting there. He didn't just go to church. He didn't just hear reading from the law. He was in the presence of God. And God gave him perspective. That's why we spoke at the beginning. That's why it's so necessary for God to breathe the truth into us. He himself breathed it into us. Because it is in those moments where they become alive and real and rich. Not just truths that we like to adopt, beliefs that we put in creedal statements. And then in verse 5 of our text, God gets everyone's attention. All the party stops. Everything stops. Now, I would bet Belshazzar had never been interrupted much in his entire life. Ever. He was a proud king of kings. Other nations bowed down to him. And if you spoke against the king or you misspoke before the king, we saw in the first 4 chapters of Daniel the ruthlessness of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, the intolerance of even the potential for wrongdoing before him. In my mind, I envisioned the party having music. That's what most parties do, right? All sorts of sin and just vileness, drunkenness. And then look at verse 5. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Here in verse 5 and 6, it denotes God begins to speak his judgment. What's interesting about this is that as God was levying judgment, there is a space where Belshazzar is not understanding the judgment. He's not understanding what's going on altogether. So his ignorance, coupled with the gravity of what he just witnessed, has sobered him up, figuratively and literally, immediately. And his heart and his mind is completely captured by perhaps an emotion he had never felt his entire life. Utter fear and terror. He's never met a nation. He's never met a king. He's never met a man that he could not subdue with his power. But suddenly, God, the creator of the universe, calls this puny little creature to give an account before him. And what is man that we can stand before the Almighty God? We are but the flower that fadeth and the the grass that dries up. God, who every heart that is ticking in this room is causing and sustaining it to tick. Every microscopic atom inside of you that science has never even discovered yet, God knows. God sees. That God is calling this man to account for his sins. The story goes on, and Belshazzar is desperate. Somebody help me. Please, somebody tell me, what does this mean? I don't even understand the language that is being spoken. Please help me. So they call all these, I imagine, and I probably need to read a little closer. I didn't pick up this detail, it just comes to mind. I wonder how many of the wise men of Babylon and the Chaldeans were there at the party. Or at least desirous to be nearby. They hurry them in there, and these men that guided him into the path and helped him to make the decisions that he had made up to this point, they're of absolutely no use when it comes to spiritual things. I want to make a point of application to our young people for just a moment. While your health is good, while things in life are great, and while your rebellion is permitted by God, while you're the fun one, while all the hobbies and habits and whatever things you want to do, everything is going smoothly, your friends in this world will be there. And yet, the moment that things pivot, something changes in your life. And suddenly, you need real help. What many people down generation after generation come to learn is that all the while they were just a means to their friend's end. All you were is the person they could have fun with. It was really not about you. All the while you, only use, was for them. And then when a real existential need comes up, is it any wonder that mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and those people who care more about your whimsical fun are the ones that surround you, help you at almost any cost to themselves? And praise God for people like that are like our Savior was. who though he was reviled, reviled not again. Though he was rejected, did not reject those who come to him humbly. And there are people within this body, and there are others in your life who love you beyond what you can do for them. But most of the world is not that way. You are just a means to their fun end. Belshazzar begins to ask for everybody's help. Nobody can. So this queen, the speculation I've heard is this was Nebuchadnezzar's wife. It's the last king in the Bible's story's wife. I don't know that that's true or not. I've not done a deep dig on that, but she says, there's this old man, and the spirit of the gods is within him. From her pagan mind, that's how she understood it. Why don't you call him? He knows interpretations and dreams. He'll be able to help you. In my mind, I've always imagined it that Daniel's sleeping, because that's when a party takes place, is at night. Old people go to bed early, right? He's asleep. And then abruptly, but it's not like that, it's urgent. It's a pounding on the door. Get up. The king needs you. Hadn't heard those words in a while. Right? Because the ungodly avoid the godly whenever all is good. When the party is well and there's plenty to drink and there's plenty of fun to be had, the kid avoids the godly friends and family and church. When all the fun is there. And listen, that is the temptation of our culture for you young people in this day, is to repeat actions that have been performed generation after generation for thousands and thousands of years. You are not somebody unique. You have not discovered some new way of doing things, and the dynamics and the temptations that you have in your behaviors are no different than what they have always been. It's the exact same. They bring Daniel before King Belshazzar. And Belshazzar has offered a great deal to have the riddle solved. Most of the time, most of us probably in this room are very, the word's escaping me here, just hesitant to part with something like money or something that, we've worked hard for, we put a lot of value in. Very often we're very, resistant to doing those things. But then there comes these flash pan moments in our lives where of such desperation where cost doesn't matter. Right? Where even things we've striven for decades to build up, I would part with in just a moment if I could ensure this would happen. That's where Belshazzar is at. He's in this place where he is so overcome by what he has seen and what he has felt and the judgment that he knows is forthcoming. He'll part with half the kingdom. What an offer. He's there with a whole bunch of kings, right? He's there with a whole bunch of royalties. He's there with a whole bunch of people whom kingdom his nation had conquered. Years of conquest, years of bloodshed, years of fortunes to pay men to go and to fight and to accumulate, years of pride standing before people, making kings bow and kneel before him to show how honorable and how great he is. And all in a moment, he's willing to part with half of it if he can just find help for this problem that he has. Let me tell you something, lost friend, today. just like Belshazzar, there comes a moment for all of us where we are confronted with God's judgment. All the accumulations, all the awards, all the friendships in the world, in light of what we're facing, at that moment will immediately become valued as nothing. That's not just the lost people, that's all of us, right? Whatever you have in your bank account, as large or small as it may be, whatever awards you have on your mantle, immediately count as nothing. Not by others, by you. You won't care whatsoever. So then Daniel begins to give him the interpretation of this. Critical to the interpretation of Daniel's pronouncement is what Belshazzar already knew. Here's what I mean by that. In the most elementary form, we hold people accountable. We have expectations on people based upon what they know. So in my household, it's pretty easy. I have step-stooled expectations, right? I don't expect a lot of Callan. So 2 days ago, he took a box of cereal and he turned it upside down and it all fell on the floor, right? And for him, that warrants a smack on the hand, right? Come on, what are you doing? If Judson has done that, different story. Different expectations, right? Because Judson knows more. He knows better. And so a truth that we find throughout Scriptures and a truth that is interwoven in this is that Belshazzar knew. And that is at the heart of Daniel's pronouncement of God's judgment. Because he begins his pronounced judgment back with Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, remember, Nebuchadnezzar got lifted up with pride. That was the story that we talked about last week. He stepped out on his balcony and he saw the greatness of his kingdom, and he accredited himself for all that he had done and all that he had accomplished. And therefore God struck him down in his pride, which he had prophesied he was going to do that. He struck him down in his pride, and for 7 years he grazed and acted like an animal. And Belshazzar knew that. And he also, it seems that Daniel is saying, knew not only the facts of the story, but the implications which were meant to be drawn from the story. Or in other words, here's what it means. If I have a story, you can know all the factual details of the story, but not know how it is to be understood and interpreted, right? Because you can read it one way, I could read it a different way. And so there could be two of us that say, you know what? That was just, he got a strange virus for 7 years. Right? That could be the way that somebody could choose to read that story, and somebody else could say, no. God purposely struck him with that. And so, as I read this, and you can read it yourself, what I see that is the reason Daniel is holding Belshazzar, or God is holding him accountable, is not just because he knew what Nebuchadnezzar did, but he knew that it came as a judgment upon Nebuchadnezzar for his pride. And that Nebuchadnezzar ignored it. And here we have the recreation of the exact same scenario, just in a different setting. A king lifted up before all the nations of the earth, thinking that it is him, that he could even defy the laws and rules of God. And God holds him in judgment. The story, look at verse 22, it says this. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all of this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified? It's a heavy thing, isn't it? You're worshiping all of these gods. And then, the powerful statement, and yet the God in whom rests your very breath, you refuse to glorify. Central to this man's judgment was his knowledge of the truth. And central to all of our judgments is the knowledge of the truth. He gives this pronouncement. You all know it probably well. Daniel reads, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, however you pronounce that. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. So, again, I think this is another one of those things that setting here and unspiritual preaching just numbs us over and over again. It just numbs us. Like the gravity of death is kind of a big deal if you really pause. Like if you really think about it, not as an abstract concept, not as something that's happened to other people, not as something that's some distant thing, but if God somehow can help you and I to just in a moment think about, and really God can impress upon our hearts the gravity of dying. It's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And here was the first pronouncement. It's over for you. Now, I think it's fitting that it's tucked within this acknowledgement that your kingdom is over. Because don't we all have miniature kingdoms? We all do. We all have these little empires and kingdoms that we build. And he tells them, it's finished. Now, perhaps it's the teacher in me. They would tell us when we taught that as you're teaching, always keep the end in mind. So no matter what you're doing along the way, if you're at the beginning of the lesson, in the middle of the lesson, if you're one day into a 50-day series, whatever, always keep the end in mind. I found that to be a very fitting life truth. Always keep the end in mind, but not like passively, like actively keeping it in mind, like really thinking about the end. His kingdom was finished. And what was the result of his kingdom being finished? How was he going to be judged? Well, that's what the next verse tells us. Thou art weighed in the balances, and are found wanting. Now, I want to step out of this narrative for a moment. And this, I don't know how this fits, but I just feel the need to bring it before you today. So in this occasion, we have one God, one man, and a judgment. And we'll notice that God is the judge. Man is the one being judged. God is pronouncing the result upon the verdict upon the man. There's an occasion in the Bible where it's in reverse. And man, it's a mighty strange thing when you read it that way. So go back. I was doing this yesterday and reading the story of Jesus' judgment when Jesus is standing. And just in the same way that this story is a microcosm of God is going to judge each person individually, look at the story as it is in the end of the Gospels of mankind standing in judgment of God with Jesus before him.
And it's a strange thing as I was reading it yesterday, that truth, the way that perspective became so real of Jesus is the embodiment of God and man is standing in judgment of God. And as he's standing there and he stands in trial after trial, he comes before the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night. And they bring these witnesses that conflict between one another. And in the end, they accuse him of blasphemy. And the blasphemy, the words that he spoke, that they accredited as blasphemy, are true words if there ever were spoken. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. He is the Son of Man. This man, Jesus, was God on earth, and he was killed. He was pronounced guilty of blasphemy for just proclaiming himself to be who he was. I am God. Man was insulted by that, even so much that he instructed that man to punch him in the face. And even Jesus responded, he says, if I spoke any error, state it. But if I speak truth, why are you hitting me? And yet even in that action, is that not often the temptation of our hearts? Is that not the exalted place where American culture has placed man to give judgment as to what God is doing and whether it is right or not? The audacity of mankind to hold the God in contempt for his actions should cause us to shudder. Who are we to judge the Almighty? He goes before the next man, Pilate. Pilate finds, it's amazing how clear it is. I find no fault in him. He has done nothing wrong. Why are you wanting to put him to death? But he does what I suspect many lost people in this room are trying to do right now. Right now. Because it's a habit that is age old. And I've seen it both here at this church, and I've seen it so many times, and so have you. What does Pilate do the first time Jesus stands before him but call him to go to somebody else that he might not have to give an answer? Oh, and man, the world has created a number of inventions today that their instrument's primary purpose is avoidance. I don't want to have to talk to somebody. And listen, this younger generation of you're particularly susceptible to this. I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to have a conversation with anybody. I don't want to have to consider hard truth. I don't want to have to face consequences to my actions. I don't want to have to give an account for the things that I have done. I don't want to be held responsible. I want to always have something benefited. Listen, you're one day going to have to give an account. And you can defer that for a time. Jesus always comes back. He went to Herod. You know what Herod concluded? This is how Pilate interpreted Herod's actions, which is correct. Herod didn't see anything wrong with him, so he sent him back to him. Pilate comes before Jesus. I imagine that's how he felt. Oh, man, I don't want to deal with this. Don't want to deal with this man. Yet in the end, what does he do? He goes along with the crowd. And you might think, and this is a point I tried to make earlier, you might think that somehow all of those people that pressured him into that decision are going to dilute somehow Pilate's personal judgment, but it won't. Pilate did what he did. And so do I. Let's set all this aside for time's sake, and let's get to one last place. And that is our judgment.
our judgment. I truly tremble to even think about this. I don't know how it's going to be. But I imagine standing and looking at the throne of God. And there sits God. God. Not hidden and invisible. God. And just me. My faculties are no longer restrained by my frail nature. And somehow, my perception of his godness is magnified. That even makes sense to you? Like, I have greater senses who I'm standing before. And the story for Belshazzar is exactly how it starts with me in heaven. All of my sin, all of my sin is brought before me. And yet on the right hand of God, there is this man named Jesus. Listen, don't let this run into fairy tale yet. Keep it real. And Jesus says, Father, I was bruised for his transgressions. The chastisement of his peace was laid upon me. And you've promised that through my stripes, he will be healed. The handwriting is there, but it's not attributed to my account. Jesus paid my debt. I'm considered forgiven by God. Following me is you lost person. The roll comes out. All of your sins. And let's just for consideration's sake, you know it's not this way. Let's say for whatever reason you were in on the last one. You got to hear the last person, and they were saved. And so there you are, you're peering at Jesus. Come on, say what you said for him. Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting. Lost friend, today, I don't have any expectations of you at this moment. My prayer is that you would not neglect to consider the judgment of the Almighty God. Outside of this religious forum that we meet in, outside of some religious compartmentalized context, friend, this is real. You will give an account to our God. Many people have proclaimed many things, and we read in the scriptures, you say, well, I'm not a bad person. Well, that's debatable, first of all. But that's what many people, Jesus prophesies. If that's your argument, Jesus prophesies about you. Many will come to me on that day saying, Lord, Lord, did I not do all these wonderful things? And yet his pronouncement will be the same. In the end, I'm closing, there will be one God, one man, and a final judgment. I'm thankful today when I am judged, I'll be judged by the righteousness of that man, Jesus Christ. I pray today, if you're lost and in sin, if you're in active rebellion against God, and that is exactly what it is. It's not apathy. It's not distraction. It's rebellion against God. I pray that you'll come to him this morning.